right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for all the people in the room and the people online. Hello, nice to see you again. This is Ontario Brain Institute's talk on nurturing the developing brain, the first in our Brain Health Across the Lifespan series. I'm Jordan Amflick, I'm a director at the OBI, and these types of public events fall under my purview. These talks are just one of the many ways that we try to bring knowledge, new ideas about the brain to you and the rest of the public, so thank you again for joining us, whether you're here in person or online. On behalf of our organization, I want to acknowledge that the OBI office is located on Toronto, the Indigenous name for Toronto, meaning the place where the water and the trees are standing. We're on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We're grateful for this opportunity to both live, work, and learn on this land, and affirm our responsibility to engage in reconciliation. As part of that commitment, we continue to seek ways to center Indigenous perspectives in our public talks and create opportunities to learn from Indigenous science and wisdom. Tonight is a good example. We'll explain the beauty, the complexity, and the societal context of the developing brain from both Western and Indigenous viewpoints. To get us started on this journey, it's my great honor to introduce Elder Carrie Moore, an Indigenous knowledge keeper from the Cree and Métis Nation. Elder Moore, I'm offering you this tobacco for the smudging ceremony you're about to lead us in and for sharing this knowledge with us as a speaker in the public talk later tonight.
Thank you, Jordan. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am Carrie Moore. I don't come from this territory. I come from Alberta, originally Saskatchewan, however. I am Métis Cree, and I'm accepted with open arms by the Treaty 7 people in Alberta. And I just wanted to say to all of the people, the Indigenous people here in this territory, thank you for letting me be in this space to speak for my people, and hopefully I'm speaking for your people as well. So thank you. So I'm beginning with a smudge ceremony today. And a smudge ceremony is not done everywhere. It is done in my territory. It's done across the prairie provinces primarily. You may begin with a Thanksgiving prayer here in Ontario. I know that the Mohawk do that, and there are many different ways we begin in a good way, but that's exactly what we are doing. We are beginning in a good way. And what does that mean exactly? What I mean by that is that as human beings, we believe as Indigenous people that we're the only species on Earth that forget who we are from time to time. All other things on Mother Earth, including the cosmos, believe in who they are and act the way they are. And so, as Indigenous people, we look to Mother Earth to help us remember who we are. And it has a lot to do with the story that you're going to hear later on today. And it's really about being connected to spirit. And spirit is not a religion. Spirit is a place in our body, deep within our belly buttons, where we're attached by the umbilical cord to our mothers. And she was attached to hers from her mother, and he was too, all through history. And we recognize that that umbilical cord is how that knowledge is passed down from the beginning of time. And we know that too in science. That's our Indigenous science. We know from cognitive science as well that we recognize the science of epigenetics passes down knowledge, both good and bad, for many generations. So Indigenous people have always known that, very scientific people. And so we want to begin in a good way. And when we begin in a good way, we go back to Mother Earth because she never forgets who she is. And we put that tobacco down. As Jordan gave me that tobacco today, Jordan is saying thank you and is showing me respect. And we do the same thing with plants and animals. We put tobacco down and we say thank you. Please help me. And that plant will not go into trauma. That plant will go, yes, respect. And that plant gives us reciprocity in return, which is its love and its kindness and its medicine. So I am using sage today. Sage comes from my territory, and I thank the people of this territory I'm going to use my medicine here. I thank you for allowing me to do that. And I work with a lady from this territory. And so I want to say that this medicine was picked in a good way too. When we picked her without pulling her from the roots, because we know as Indigenous people from our stories that all things are created equal. That includes Mother Earth, not just human beings. And all things on Mother Earth carry spirit. All things, not just human beings, not just animals. And we know that in our spirit is where we carry our values of love and kindness and respect and honesty and courage and integrity and all those beautiful, beautiful values, all things carry in their belly button. Even animals. Plants carry theirs in their root. So we never pull anything from the root, because the other thing that all things carry is the ability to grow and live in families, including plants. When we pull them from the roots, we pull them from their families. And we do know through science that plants will go into trauma if you pull them from the roots, just like children. So it's important to know that as human beings from an Indigenous perspective, not just here, Indigenous people everywhere around the world have very similar teachings, very similar. And so, excuse me. And so when we are beginning in a good way, and we begin our day this way, we begin our events, we begin our ceremonies, everything we do, we begin in a good way, because we want everybody to come down into their spirit. So that when we begin, everybody is coming from their spirit. Our spirit carries our values, our brain carries our behaviors. And so we want to get people out of their brain when we begin and bring them down into their belly button, because a miracle happens when we come into our belly buttons, a miracle. When we take that breath and come down into our belly button, or we hold a baby, or we ride horses, or we pet that dog, or we eat chocolate, or whatever it might be, where we go, a cup of tea, whatever it might be, however you get into your spirit. When we come down into our spirit, we drop into our prefrontal cortex, right above our eyebrows. And that is where we learn, where we build relationships, where we solve problems, where we do multitasking. And only when we're in our spirit does that happen. And that is the most fundamental learning that we offer people, is that don't teach me from my brain until I trust you, until I build that relationship with you, because I won't hear you. I won't remember what you've said to me. And so I'm going to light this beautiful, beautiful smudge. I picked her in the right way, and I'm going to offer her to you from here. And when I offer her to you, you can smudge with her. Just by reaching out to her. Take a breath, everyone, because this doesn't work unless you're in your belly button. If you're in your brain, it doesn't work. You have to go. So take a breath. Come down into your belly button. This is not your belly button. This is not your belly button. This is your belly button. And a lot of people tell me it's been a long time since they've been in their belly button. Your belly button is where your authentic self resides. That's what makes us all equal. When we are in our belly button, we are all equal. Plants, animals, people, the cosmos, everything. We are all equal. And when we do this, we're getting rid of those things. And as I come down my body, I'm coming closer to my spirit, which is in the center of my body. And as I come into the center of my spirit, now I remember who I am. And so let me offer this blessing to all of you. And I will offer it in my way. I will offer it in English. We begin in a good way in many different ways, in many different languages. Our languages vibrate at the same level as Mother Earth. That's why we speak many languages. And so let me offer this to all of you, no matter where you come from originally, no matter who you are. We never ask you, as Indigenous people, what you do, because what you do does not really matter to us. Who you are will determine whether you are successful in this world or not. Who you are, not what you do. What you do is your incredible skill, and you need to have that too. But to make you really good at what you do, you need to know who you are. So take a breath and let me offer this blessing so we can begin in a good way. Creator, giver of all life, grandmothers and grandfathers of all four directions. Nandisiakasom wakamihiganagokaskweo, nitanako, mikochis sanaki. My name is Carrie. We are truly grateful to have another day, Creator. We're truly grateful that we are safe. And we ask that you watch over our families and our communities so they are safe today as well. We send out our love and kindness into the universe. Never doubt for one moment that your intentions will travel, because they will. So think about love today. Think of those that may be ill that you know, or those you do not know. Think of those that may be at war. Think of those that may be in grief. And breathe into your belly button and send your love out into the universe. And we ask Creator that our love and kindness, because we're safe at this time, can be shared with those who really need it. May it find its way to them. And may those people who really need it have hope to continue on in a good way. We are truly grateful, Creator, for the work that you have given all of us to do on brain science, on relational science, and all the other work that we do to help each other and to help this world. We ask that you continue to help us, Creator, and guide us, protect us, and bless us. Miigwech. Hi, hi, hi. Thank you.
Thank you, Elder Moore, for helping us open this in a good way. Now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Jeff Pradella, CEO of the Kids Brain Health Network, who's our presenting partner for this talk. The Kids Brain Health Network is a Canada-wide innovation network focused on creating solutions for kids, youth, and families impacted by neurodevelopmental disorders. Jeff.
Thanks, Jordan, and thank you again, Elder Carey, for your meaningful words and the smudging ceremony that truly grounded us in a good and respectful way during our times together. As you heard, my name is Jeff Pradella. I have the honor of serving as CEO for Kids Brain Health Network, and I come to you today as someone who lives, works, and plays within the traditional unceded territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in Alberta, which is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta District 5 and 6. We're pleased to be at an event that supports healthy brain development in children, while inviting us into a holistic approach to brain health that is culturally informed and culturally sensitive, informed by two-eyed seeing and open minds, while intersecting with and complementing Western science. Our thanks to the Ontario Brain Institute for inviting us to contribute as the presenting partner for this valuable talk on nurturing the developing brain, with so many knowledgeable contributors on the panel that I'm really looking forward to hearing. At Kids Brain Health Network, we've invested over 14 years in bridging gaps between scientific research and innovation through to action, when it comes to health and well-being of children with neurodevelopmental disabilities such as autism, FASD, and cerebral palsy, along with their families. People from all backgrounds experience neurodevelopmental disabilities, and everyone can benefit from learning about practices that support early brain health, which influence us through to adulthood and into our senior years. So this focus truly has a lifetime return on investment. KBHN is dedicated to ensuring solutions and innovations ultimately reach every child in Canada who can benefit from access to them. And this is now our primary focus under the Strategic Science Fund for the next 5 years. We do focus on early identification, early intervention and treatment, as well as family support, so that all children living with the challenges from NDDs get what they need to truly enjoy the best quality of life, have opportunities to participate in a truly inclusive society, and to ultimately reach their full potential. As a Canada-wide research and innovation network, we offer funding and program supports to a broad range of innovations and innovators. We collaborate with partners at the national, provincial, and local community level, like OBI, to maximize the impact of our collective work, ensuring translation and mobilization of research and knowledge makes it into innovation and practice, and ultimately into the hands of the kids we care most about. Scores of researchers in developing impressive evidence-based solutions for the most pressing problems impacting our ecosystem of kids, their families, caregivers, and communities, ultimately get implemented in the real world where they reach the kids who need them most. One just small example of our network's widespread initiatives is the Infant and Early Mental Health Hub for training, resources, and tools. This hub builds on work done in collaboration over a long period with elders and Indigenous representatives and First Nations and Métis communities. Advisors who provided resources and information that helped develop the respect and supportive frameworks informed by Indigenous communities in Canada. The hub also provides access to foundational programs like Hand in Hand and Nurturing the Seed, incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing, learning, and being. The initiative includes training, coaching, tools, and resources, and regular access to new and cutting-edge practices specific to infant and early mental health. We're here today because the Ontario Brain Institute is dedicated to communicating directly with the public and engaging all of us in the exciting advances that are happening in neuroscience and brain health across our entire country. As KBHN, we're also here to support work that ensures Canadian children with NDDs and their families are seen, heard, supported, and truly engaged. We know that investing in better assessment tools, supports, and systems improves children's lifelong well-being, potential, and participation in their world. We thank all of you for valuing, as we do, the importance of giving children the opportunity to live their best lives. It's now my privilege to introduce you to our moderator, Olivia Gauche-Swaby. Olivia is a Vanier Canada doctoral scholar in neuroscience at Western University's Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry. She's dedicated to understanding the mechanisms governing memory and learning in obesity and aging. So welcome, give us a hearty welcome to Olivia, who's your moderator.
Hi, everyone. I am so honored to be here today as a moderator for this event. Just to give you an overview of what today will look like, we'll spend about 45 to 50 minutes discussing with our awesome panelists here today on our topic, and then we'll also go into asking the audience some questions throughout today's conversation. And then for those of you tuning in live on our stream, you can send us your questions directly to communications@braininstitute.ca, or you can use the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen to submit any questions you may have. And then for those of you here in person, when you have a question, please raise your hand. There's volunteers around the space who will come by with a sheet of paper where you can note down your question for us. And then it'll come back to me and we'll ask them and get everyone engaged up here today. Again, you can also to tune in on your phone, and you can email communications@braininstitute.ca with additional questions. So let's get into the meat of it. Let's introduce our panelists for today. First up, we have Dr. Stephanie Amos, a senior scientist and the associate director of the Kundal Center for Child and Youth Depression at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, as well as a member of the cohort network for adolescents and youth with multimorbid mental health conditions, CALM. Second up, we have Dr. Jennifer Crosby, a clinical psychologist and clinician scientist within the Department of Psychiatry at SickKids, and a member of the Province of Ontario Neurodevelopment Disorders POND Network. Next, we have Amanda Kirpin-Message, a parent and caregiver, as well as a member of the Childhood Cerebral Palsy Integrated Neuroscience Discovery Network, CPNet, stakeholder advisory group. Unfortunately, she can't be here today because she is sick, but has given us permission to share her thoughts throughout today's conversation. So I'll do my best to integrate that as we discuss today. Next, we have Wendy Catherine, a midwife and health strategist by background and leader, co-creator of health promotion programs. She's also a reproductive care, inclusion, and equity strategy practitioner and the executive director of Health Nexus and First Exposure. And finally, Métis Cree elder Carrie Moore. She is a private practitioner in social work, specializing in intergenerational trauma and grief. She also provides consulting and training in indigenizing strategies to ministries, education, health, justice, and agencies who work with Indigenous people and communities. She also serves as the elder for the Lodge and wellness elder for the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Calgary. And she's currently working with Health Nexus Santé as well. So welcome everyone up here on the stage today. A round of applause for our panelists for joining us in an exciting conversation that holds kind of dear to my heart as well, which inspired me to get into neuroscience, is understanding the developing brain, especially with someone who's had a relative very close to me who was born with a neurodevelopmental disorder. So let's just open up the floor a bit. Let's get into discussion. Let's kind of give everyone a bit more context on tonight's conversation. So I'm going to turn to you, Jennifer. What have researchers learned about childhood brain development through studying brain disorders and mental health conditions?
All right, well, that's a big question.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure I'll be able to answer it all, but I will start off with a few points about where we are, and then I'm sure we'll get to hear lots of interesting and great points from the rest of our panelists. So we do know a lot. We've learned a lot about child and adolescent development and how it relates to mental health and brain health overall. We know that childhood and adolescence is a very rich time of development, and the brain is both very resilient and adaptable, but also highly sensitive. When we think about development overall, we really used to see child and adolescence as the key points, and we know that how the brain is interacted with in those periods has a very significant impact on adult health, mental health, physical health, and outcomes. But I think as we've learned what we've learned, we know that there's much that we don't know. And we're really starting to see the brain as really very adaptive right through the lifespan. And so while we know that childhood and adolescence are really important periods, we also know that the brain is resilient and there's many adaptations that can happen right through the lifespan. When we start to think about the research that's been done around understanding brain development and changes that might be associated with brain conditions and mental health, much of early research was looking at how certain parts of the brain may differ across specific conditions. But a lot of work now, particularly in POND, and my colleagues, including some early work by Dr. Amos and the work that's funded by the Brain Institute, the Ontario Brain Institute, we're looking more now at changes that actually are often across different conditions. So it's not always that these changes that we're seeing are specific to one mental health outcome or condition. It's sometimes spread across and often has to do with a particular outcome, a particular behavior, maybe a particular trait. And it's really helping us understand different ways of thinking about how we might create interventions, intervene, and think about what factors might be important for early intervention. The last thing I'll say before I hand it over to our panel is the other piece that I think we were always aware of and we knew was important to the brain, but now I think that we're getting to a point where research may be in a position to start to think about and explore this, is the many factors that we know influence the brain. We know genetics and epigenetic factors influence the brain. We also know that there's a number of environmental factors, how we're interacted with as a child early on, how our family is interacted with can have a major impact. Adversity can have a major impact. And conversely, there's many things that can be done that can be protective. We know about environmental factors that can be protective, like green space, or negative, like environmental factors like pollution. But more and more, we're really starting to acknowledge the impact of social determinants of health and how those can have a really important influence on individuals and the systems that they live in. So I think as the neuroscience world comes together and starts to think about what will come next, many of these factors are on our minds, and hopefully will continue to grow and add to the information that we have.
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions that are starting to kind of come out in the woodwork right now with how we address and look at brain development over time. So I'm curious, Stephanie, with how the research is changing, if any, what are we doing to better understand childhood brain development?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's great to pick up where Jen left off in terms of talking about what the next frontier is. So, when I think about where we've come, so when I entered this space, it's just a little under 30 years ago. It's hard to believe myself, but that it's been that long. But what the kind of brain research that we had was much smaller scale, so smaller studies. Oftentimes, we would have brain imaging studies that was at one time point, but across a population that had a wide age span, right? So if you're studying a population that's like 8 to 18, you can look at how the brain differs across that sample and kind of extrapolate what's changing over that developmental period. But that doesn't tell you what's changing in those individuals over time. So there was that. We would have longitudinal studies, but those longitudinal studies may have been small, not necessarily in a representative sample. And also as an early stage researcher, when I was first starting, the only way you could have access to those samples, even some of the rare, really big ones, was whoever your supervisor was. And so now, sort of fast forward all the way to where we are now, things have changed a lot. So we now have these big data sets that are open access. So the neuroscience and research community, a lot of studies are trying to make their data public, including OBI. All of the studies that are funded by OBI have to share their data. And that creates way more opportunities for people to look at the data and actually look at it in creative and different ways and support the gaining of knowledge from research data sets. So that's something that has changed. We have studies that are huge, 10,000 people. So there's a very famous large-scale collaboration in the United States called the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. It's across many different sites in 10,000 children, 9 to 10 years old, and following them every year. And not only is there brain imaging data, but there's also really rich information about people's backgrounds, their cultural identities, their gender identities, their socioeconomic backgrounds, things about social determinants of health. And so the opportunity to learn more across a representative sample, because the idea is to recruit individuals from very different backgrounds, which is also something that has changed a lot. So all of those things are what's changing. And what's really exciting is that it's happening in Canada too. Mm-hmm. So over the last 10 years, since OBI has been funding these large data platforms, there's been the PON study, the Province of Ontario Neurodevelopmental Disorders Network that Jen mentioned, which it was a really cutting-edge study when it first started 10 years ago and ongoing, across individuals who had autism, but also OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, to learn what's similar, what's different. And now we have kind of the next generation of studies. There's one that I'm part of that you mentioned, the cohort network of adolescents with multiple mental health conditions. Another big change is that we're engaging people with lived and living experience to be part of these studies, co-develop them, figure out what we want to focus on, engage them, make sure that burden remains minimal when people are coming into these research studies, so that we can keep them in our studies over time, and really learn how the brain develops, not just in a small sample of individuals, not just in a narrow subset of our population, but across really diverse individuals. And not just in normative, so-called normative development, but also in individuals who have neurodevelopmental conditions, multiple mental health conditions. So I think we're at a really exciting time. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it sounds like it's in Canada and Ontario that we have access to these large-scale studies and databases, but also that two-way street, right? Learning from those who are engaging in our research and in our work, and understanding some of the needs there, and bringing in diverse perspectives to start answering some cool questions. And so kind of building on that, so thank you, Stephanie, for that insight. I want to move over to Carrie and Wendy. As I understand it, you have been using a relational science methodology, which also uses kind of this longitudinal or lifespan approach. So how has messaging around brain health research been adapted to Indigenous settings? And why is this work so important?
Well, it's very important because what we've seen over time is that Indigenous people are not really understanding the languages, I guess, that we use when we're describing brain health. And Indigenous people don't believe that the brain is the first place we start. Indigenous people are great feelers. We feel first before we think. And the reason for that is that we believe that we need to be in our spirit first, which is where our values are, in order to build a relationship with everyone around us. And so it's difficult for us to understand when we're talking about the brain, when we don't see life as just the brain. When I talk about relational, I'm talking about the environment, I'm talking about human beings, I'm talking about the weather, I'm talking about everything and how it creates the inability for us to move forward in the way we would like to, or how we see the world because of what is happening around us. So relational science is based on a model which looks at who we are first. It doesn't look at what is wrong or what has happened. And that is probably one of the biggest issues that we have is when we talk about what happened to create this behavior, we sometimes get stuck in the what happened. So part of what we do in our worldview is we tell stories about who we are before colonization, before all of these things happened, so that we have a place to land, a space that is truly who we are. And the model that we use within our relational science model is a model that's been used since the beginning of time. We talk about who we are first, then you talk about what happened, not what's wrong with us, what happened to create the behaviors, the issues, whatever might be going on. Then we talk about how are we going to heal, how are we going to support each other in this healing journey. And finally, we end up with the cognitive, which is where am I going? So you can see how within an Indigenous model, it's kind of upside down compared to you, but you're upside down compared to us, because we look at the brain as the focus of everything, but we don't do that. We look at the spirit and how we are connected and who we are first before we get to the brain. And there's a lot of reasons why we do that. One of them is because when people are in trauma or have a neurodevelopmental disorder or whatever that might be that we're working with, they can't think. And when you can't think, you won't remember what people have told you. And that's the biggest issue. So to us, we're not adapting to that model that is coming from brain science. And by the way, I was the Indigenous consultant for brain science, so that was one of the things that I said to Nancy Mannix is, this is not going to work in Indigenous communities. And I took that model and I took it back to our original teachings. It wasn't adapting to that model, because our original teachings teach us how to parent. Our original teachings teach us all about LGBTQ+. Our teachings teach us all about how people treat one another. Our teachings did all of that and still do. And that is why that model that we are using is getting people back to understanding that you have to work with who we are first. And when I ask that question, a lot of people will say to me, what do you mean by that? Because a lot of people don't know who they are. We're so used to people telling us who we are. We're so used to people telling us who we're supposed to be that we forget those original thoughts, those original ways of being brought up, where we knew that we were love and kindness and respect and cared for, but something happened. And that is what we have to work together on, not by merging those two systems, but by walking in a parallel path. We cannot do this as Indigenous people by ourselves. We do need non-Indigenous people who have those teachings in neuroscience and the research. And I think we should do more research around that particularly. I think it would be really, really good to look at an Indigenous interpretation of what does that look like. And when we set that up so that we're involved with ceremony, because ceremony is our way of getting back into our spirit. When we do that, then maybe we'll be able to see how we work together and how we're going to do that. Yeah. So.
There's a real opportunity, I think, among so many complementary projects understanding neuroscience. There's a little bit of almost a complementary nature to how each study and the language can focus on the development, the milestones, the hemispheres, the right and left, the different ways we look at implementation science and these outcomes. And there's something between, Carrie and I were talking about this and really looking and examining some of the models and found ourselves almost discovering maybe there's a prequel. Not something that is not in sync with the other models, but something that explains an earlier original knowledge that is traditional and in fact part of Indigenous ways of knowing, that anchors some of this and may explain why outcomes can be differential between different populations, and ways of using models like Carrie's, which looks, when we describe it, she teaches this at the Calgary Lodge and in the academic settings, but it's a very simple and elegant way of understanding. You could see a spiral. To some people it looks like a medicine wheel, although it's not. It's a very simple understanding, but it's a way of conveying some of these basic understandings that get broken down when we're in an encounter with a client, patient, family, community member. And when you go right to the cognitive, you say, why are you here? And you talk about the trauma or the issues or the condition. And then you right away get to care pathway planning or navigation or understanding cognitive aspects of the disease. Maybe there's an opportunity that we've missed to connect and bring a kind of a centered nature to to the way of understanding, that it becomes an antecedent to the problem altogether. And we're looking at this at the individual level, like, why do people look down when we're in a visit? What is that? What's going on? And it's been looked at as everything from non-compliance to shyness to all kinds of other neurotypical and atypical behaviors. But this whole ability for us to self-identify feelings, understandings, we call it empowerment. We talk about trauma-informed care. But those strengths that are underneath are something that maybe there are models that could reawaken that type of knowledge as a complementary leverage to all of the other science that's going on. And so Carrie and I have been working in this space. It's a bit of a niche, but it may have application, we think, to a lot of the very well-regarded and well-established scientific models that are here at OBI and within the kids' brain health ecosystem. We're super excited that the new vision of that organization will be to seed and scale. And that means that we have the opportunity to look at population implementation for groups that may have been overlooked or who can contribute themselves to the science. So this is a really great opportunity, cross-disciplinary, to look at these.
I think it's important to remember that what's good for Indigenous people is good for all people, because we all came from that place of community and family, connecting to spirit. And I work with a great many people who are coming from other places in the world that are in Canada now, and they seek the elders out and they say, this is exactly what we do in my country. We smudge, we sit in circle, we come down into spirit. So what we are talking about as Indigenous people of Canada is what all Indigenous people talk about across the world. And we're very fortunate because we've only been colonized for a few hundred years, whereas many other cultures in the world have been colonized for hundreds of years. So we still have the narratives and the stories, and it's through the stories that we teach and we help people to understand through the stories. And of course, we know that narrative therapy has become a very important therapy that we use. But we've been telling stories since the beginning of time, so that rather than tell a child, don't do this, we told a story. And in that story, that child learned about, maybe I shouldn't do this, and oh, that poor this and whatever. So it's not a far-fetched sort of understanding of how you work with individuals and families to help them. It's been around since the beginning of time, and all cultures have a similar way of telling stories and teaching.
Yeah, and you got me thinking, how, and maybe you could speak to this to Wendy and Carrie, how do we like engage in that prequel a bit more, rather than kind of diving into the science? How do we make sure that we're going back and reflecting on kind of what has come before? What's the knowledge that's been there for quite a bit of time that might be rooted in some of the discoveries we have now?
We run a risk of being pan-Indigenous. I'm not an Indigenous person, and in engaging with Carrie, I'm learning so much about Métis Cree tradition and the stories that come from that territory, and Carrie's background. Testing and looking at this as a prequel means measuring it up against other models and seeing what do elders in other territories think. You know, coming to another person's territory, as you heard Carrie say, there would be a whole other curriculum, a whole other set of stories based on the land in that setting. And in many communities, we've got a hybrid or a, really heterogeneous way of learning about different Métis, First Nations and Inuit peoples in Canada. At this point now, how we're choosing, and there's so many ways to get deeper into it, we're really choosing to look at the early years, perinatal and that time period of bonding and attachment is a very opportune time to kind of imagine what that knowledge could be in an intergenerational context, and be able to look, it could be biomarker trained, right? It could be, but it's interrupting the discussion about, say, adverse childhood experiences, and it's going back to say, okay, what baseline are we talking about here? And what kind of story work. I'm not going to say a story because it's not the brain story. It's the stories of the people who need to learn or are engaged in the learning process. So what we're learning is you go to those elders. And the step-by-step process as the prequel would be how to set the conditions for well-being, for learning, for being in the spirit even before you start. There's a lot. Some of it is study design.
Yeah.
Some of it is
Like
community
co-creation.
engagement. Some of it may be data governance. But some of it may also be that we're not really set up to look for this, but to look at from we call it the research subject, the individual's perspective, right? Of how are they going to feel when they begin, and will there be this epistemic trust that enables them to share what they need to share, and that the information, the curriculum, the study objective is being interacted over in that process. And you know, the traditional elements of it would say if you get off the wrong track, you've got to go back to the beginning and reset.
Reset. Yeah.
So I would say that's sort of we're trying to stay in that, what does that reset look like? And to help practitioners, scientists, study designers to build that part perhaps in. And there's lots of study yet to do. So we hope that we'll be able to have this conversation with so many different existing studies and territorial representatives. It's the beginning, I would say, of a two-eyed conversation.
For sure. Yeah.
You know, we sometimes get a bit of a two-eyed migraine over it, but it's hard to focus on one hemisphere and be so linear in some ways, and also start opening this up into storytelling, poetry, interdisciplinary exchange of information, and that curriculum can look very different.
No, it's got me thinking about it too, because we had some discussions before coming into today's panel with Amanda, who isn't here today, but she's someone who has a child with cerebral palsy, and she's been thinking about ways that she engages with her family, not just her own child with cerebral palsy, but parenting two other children as part of that, and keeping that approach there. And so I asked her, like, what's her holistic approach to brain health and well-being in terms of being a parent of 3 children, one with impacted by cerebral palsy. She shared this information with us, so I'm going to just share it here today. But both her and her husband make sure to have one-on-one time with their children, and kind of no preferential treatment. So being able to hear their perspectives and checking in frequently, understanding that the same approach needs to be made in terms of disciplinary measures, and understanding that their mental health is really important to that, and checking in frequently. She also talks about how resilient her family members are, especially those even without a brain disorder. For example, her eldest daughter is extremely creative, adjusted, and is able to adapt in all kinds of environments, which really makes Amanda excited. And she thinks this has helped because they all kind of live in this extraordinary circumstance at home. And so it's got me thinking about resiliency and being able to adapt to these different environments and taking on these different holistic approaches. And so I'm going to kind of spin off of that and go over to you, Stephanie, and ask you a question about kind of this group resiliency. And sometimes in science and research, we can often refer to our ability to adapt and adjust and our brain's ability to do so as neuroplasticity. Can you please tell us a bit more about this concept and share how we might support children in keeping their brains healthy, kind of taking on this approach?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So first, just picking up on that idea of resiliency and kind of thinking about and hearing Wendy and Carrie speak makes me think about another way that our brain research has changed. We used to flatten everybody into one group, right? And we wanted to do that so that we could see the average difference in a group with some atypical, we would call it, or difference in terms of the way that they developed. And what we learned is that there really is no average that tells us anything meaningful about how a particular group, whether it's a group with a mental health diagnosis or even a particular injury, whatever it is, that there's no average that is meaningful because there's so much variation within those groups and there's so much overlap and crossover. And now we've sort of figured out that you have to look at individual variation. And it makes me think of, you know, that individual story. And it almost seems like there's an opportunity for, you know, getting back to who a person is and kind of moving beyond sort of flattening everybody into that group space. Neuroplasticity is really the concept of how the brain is dynamic and it changes. It changes over development. The brain structure changes rapidly. Jen was picking up on this in early development and well into the third decade of life. There's big changes in terms of different areas of the brain and how they change and kind of reach maturity over time. And what's really neat is that as your skills develop, that really reflects the areas of the brain that are developing underlying that skill development, and your brain develops kind of in a wave from regions that support very basic things to regions that support very complicated things and actually require lots of experiential input over time in order to kind of reach that full maturation well into the third decade of life. The brain also continues to change, we've learned. In adulthood, you can stretch and change the brain based on experience. And there have been these fascinating studies looking at like London taxi drivers and seeing how their hippocampus, which is an area of the brain that's really important for memory and spatial navigation, is way bigger than other individuals, or musicians who have specialized training and regions of their brain that support those skills are different. And you can stretch and change your brain if you go through a juggling exercise over 3 months of training, or if you do an exercise training sort of a program that can also stretch and change your brain. And you can actually see these changes at the group level if you use brain imaging, which is just fascinating to see, to be able to sort of tap into that. And of course, neuroplasticity also relates to when there's an injury, that there can be adaptation and change and compensation whereby other regions of the brain can pick up and compensate for regions that have been injured. When it comes to resiliency and keeping the brain healthy, I mean, those early developmental time points are really critical time points to really try and grow and stretch the brain in optimal ways. So exposing kids to enriched environments, which is not to say expensive environments. It's environments where they can experience love and relationships and novelty and learning new things and trying new things out. Of course, food, diet, and exercise are all really important to help grow and shape the brain in an optimal way to set somebody up for to have what we would call like cognitive reserve or brain reserve, so that they have a little space and a little bit of a cushion if, you know, for whatever they experience in life.
And I'm thinking back to this idea of this relational methodology and approach. So I was going to ask you, Carrie, in terms of how we take that relational approach in terms of molding or trying to create a healthy brain. What have you learned in working in the brain science world at ways we can take this relational approach? And how can those in the communities and supporting that development really help address that well?
Well, I think one of the biggest issues is the trauma that we've experienced in our communities has really stopped that parenting that we would have had long before residential schools and many of the other things that really traumatized our people. So what happened was, in colonization, specifically in residential school and many other ways, it was the children who were colonized. The parents fought. And so those little children did not develop the ability to understand what a healthy attachment was, or how to work through problems and the things that we would do in a healthy environment. And so those parents, those children grew up to be parents and still didn't have anyone there to support them because of the severe trauma in their lives, and they passed down what they knew. So what you're seeing within Indigenous worldviews is they're learning something that isn't who they are. It's something that happened. And that's why you go back to the beginning and you talk about that relationship and how our parents didn't have choices to make. They learned how to survive through their anger or their depression or their anxiety, fight, flee, freeze. And many of our people still have trauma and they're not aware of it. It's been passed down for more than 7 generations maybe. And so as a child, we recognize as Indigenous elders and as people that we love and we nurture those children just like we always would. And when we come out of that whole trauma, we're able to do that. But there are so many people that are still stuck in the trauma. And we have to realize that who we are was exactly that, nurturing, loving parents, where the whole community cared for that child, where the whole community taught that child as the child would come. They would teach them different things. They'd watch them. They protected them. So before all of the colonization that happened to us as Indigenous people, and happens to a lot of people everywhere in the world, we've all been colonized. Somehow you make your way out of it because of what you learn along the way. Sometimes you don't. So you can only pass down what you know. And so when we think of relationships and how we raise children, that knowledge is still there within our Indigenous worldview. We have to remind our communities of that and take them back to that through those stories that we learned and actually help people and learn. But there's so many different sides to that because the parents who still have trauma have to heal their trauma in order to know how to do that too. So the way that this model works around that healing is it's talking about the community relationship and how we were raised. And it takes it right to the individual and who they are and why they have those behaviors. And what I have discovered is that a lot of people don't know that their behaviors aren't normal. It's normal to them. They've seen it for generation after generation. So when they start to hear the stories and go back to their old ways of knowing and their ceremonies, what happens is their brain changes. And as we know, with a repetitive positive new experience, the brain actually forms new neural connections. And that's what we have to do. So sometimes the programs that we offer, which are a one-time thing, are wonderful, but they're not sustainable. Because if you're not doing a repetitive positive, they're not having a repetitive positive experience where they're having success with that, then their brain is going to go right back to the old routine. So there are lots of different components to this, but know that when we go back to the old stories of creation stories about raising children, our people in our community get that. And we just have to keep reminding and keep helping them as much as we can on a repetitive basis to help them change their brains and learn how to parent the way we used to and deal with the understanding of what trauma is. I mean, we're all talking about trauma as maybe an underlying issue, but truly trauma stops people in their tracks from moving forward in a healthy way in their lives. And I tell people all the time, all of us have been traumatized. It doesn't matter who we are. We've all been traumatized. were coming to Canada for various different reasons, probably have been put under a lot of trauma before we got here. So other people who are not Indigenous are experiencing trauma too, but many of us find our way out of that trauma, but many of us do not. And there's probably people today that have no idea that they have trauma, and they have the 3 behaviors which are trauma related: anger, anxiety, and depression. Those are trauma behaviors. So when I see people that have a lot of anxiety or anger or depression, I say, where did the trauma happen in your life? And that's where the stories come from, right? It may not be in this generation. It might have been 3 generations before. But we're always trying to get people have to be aware of their trauma before they can change their behaviors, and it can be that quick. And then you can go back to who you really are and how you raise children and being connected to spirit. But people have to be aware that their behaviors are coming directly perhaps from trauma that is unresolved. And until we deal with that, and that's why we do that through story. When I say, tell me your story, I'm not asking about their trauma story. I'm asking about their origin story. And a lot of people don't remember. And we have to go back and get the elders to talk about it. And then they go, oh, I didn't know that, right? And then as you progress, you say, tell me your story. Tell me what happened. So the story is the assessment tool that we use in this model. You see the story change each time you see the person come to you, and they get to know that I'm not asking about their trauma story anymore. I'm asking about, tell me your story today. And through when you look at all of the things that are happening that are positive in your life, you start to realize, I can do this. This is who I am. And you start to see those behaviors change within that person. And when you see that change stopping in a person, they have the ability then to raise their children in a different way with different choices. So.
Yeah, and this is making me think back to some discussions that we had in preparation for this talk. So Manda, who isn't here today, she spoke about the power of positivity and kind of being able to find that place as parents, especially parents of a child with some sort of developmental disorder, and going back to that positivity and finding that. Do you have any strategies or ideas on which, and what has worked in your communities and those you've worked with, and talking about how the brain can develop by going back to those stories and finding positivity? What are some ways in which we can do that and do that effectively?
Well, I think because I'm a therapist, I do that all the time, right? Yeah. It's something that I always say, I don't ask people what they're there for necessarily as the first thought. I say, tell me your story. So we recognize that there are a lot, our senses get us into trauma. Only our senses are going to get us out of trauma. That's the very basic of trauma. So a lot of people talk about trauma in a different way, but really what's happening in our external environment is going to determine whether we feel safe or not. And if we don't feel safe because of what we hear, see, smell, taste, feel, we're going to go right into our trauma brain. And some people literally have been in their trauma brain all their lives because they don't find anything safe. And they might have received trauma since when they were a child, and they've never really been able to develop their brain further because they haven't had the stimulation and the positive interaction between adults to help them move forward in that. So it's, I think the most important thing we have to recognize is a lot more people have trauma than what we think. And I know you're talking about neurodevelopmental disorder too, but a lot of people have a lot of different issues because of their environment too, right? And so we have to recognize that what do we do in the environment to prevent some of those things from happening, and really understand that the behavior that is foremost in a trauma person is anger, anxiety, and depression. And we often see those 3 behaviors as a mental health disorder, which they can be, but trauma is curable. Mental health disorders are treatable. And I think it's important to recognize that when I am seeing those three behaviors in my community, and I see it all the time, it's because of what has happened to them. And it's been passed down. And when people realize that those behaviors are not theirs, they belong to an ancestor who really was being traumatized. Maybe it did happen to them and they're traumatized too, but when they realize that that behavior was passed down to them and that you shouldn't have those behaviors unless you're in danger, that it's like a light bulb goes off. It changes everything. They go, wow, I didn't know that. Excuse me. So I think it's important to just when we see, when we see brain development, there are a lot of people that have trauma, and we do not look at that close enough, I don't think, in the Western science or in the Indigenous science. That's all we talk about. And I think we have to come together and look at what trauma is doing to people to create those behaviors, and including the addictions that come with that, to try and really push away those terrible thoughts that we have, right? I mean, all of these things are connected, sometimes creating not very good outcomes, right?
Right.
So it's important that people recognize that the trauma that they are experiencing in their life, which is related to the behaviors they have, maybe they aren't theirs anymore. And now they have a choice. And what choice are they making? And I ask that of people. What choice are you going to make? And they go, wow, no one ever asked me that before. So that's how I approach it. But I'm coming at it as a therapist within a community, healing a community and an individual. I think that, excuse me, we have to work together, because the outcomes of what I'm talking about are often what you are seeing in your research, and we have to work more with Indigenous communities and hear what they have to say about things, not assume what they are saying. I think that's a big thing too.
No, that's really important. And it makes me think critically, just like even my own experiences and knowing how my development was shaped along the way. And that comes from intergenerational trauma and understanding that, unpacking it, finding our story, right? That's really important. And I want to just kind of go back to more of that holistic approach, or adding to that holistic approach, I mean, in looking at, for example, Jen, when you're working with families and parents, especially with those with children with neurodevelopmental conditions, what can you share in terms of coping strategies and how thinking positively, adding to what Carrie had said, in the importance of that development period?
Yeah, I think that having patient and family and youth engagement is really important. Hearing the perspectives, being very reflective of, in a particular individual, what's important to them. So all of our research has been very informed. We try to be as informed as possible. I think we're always learning, but definitely having families engage specifically in thinking about the design and how we're conducting our research and what the outcomes are and how we understand it, I think is really important to figuring out, we as researchers sometimes have a question we want answered, but I think understanding what the families and the youth, what do they want to understand? Where do they want to see change? So I think that's really important in thinking about, what's going to be positive for them. That's one element of it, that true engagement in trying to make sure that the research that we're doing is going to be producing information that's going to be helpful to the people who we're intending it for. But I also think taking a strength-based approach. I work with lots of families who, there's struggles for sure, and part of why they're engaging with me is to sort of identify that and maybe come up with some strategies to help. But in the context of talking about what's difficult, also reflecting where are the strengths here? How can we leverage those strengths, and making sure that individuals and family members are constantly keeping those in mind. I think when you're really kind of struggling with the difficulty, it's easy for everybody in the family to be focused on that, but to try to remind people to take a step back and say, okay, you know what, let's figure out what strength the family can bring or this individual has, and to really think about that from a point of resilience and positivity, and to not overly focus on, of course, be aware and know that that's the plan is to try to make some headway in the areas that are hard, but to also be aware of when things move positively, even if it's small steps, and where the strengths are. So that's the approach I often encourage families to do, and encourage them to kind of step back and be able to reflect a little bit on that themselves, to see how the journey is moving forward, or how they can kind of rely on each other and the community and the individual themselves around what strengths they have.
Yeah, I like that approach because you're less inclined to compare. I feel like that's kind of sometimes the default is like, oh, where is my child in development compared to someone else? But understanding that each of those milestones, whether they're small or large, are really important as part of that. I really, really like that. And I think I just want to remind the audience, those in the live stream, to send in some questions because I'm seeing them pour in right now. That's why I'm peeking at the screen in front of me. And I want to start moving into some of those questions and see if we can answer them with this really amazing expert of panelists here. So some that are kind of touching on the same note is around kind of the parent or caregiver approach to development and ensuring that where you need to identify or understand that there may be changes in your child that you should watch out for. That's something that has come up in some of these questions. So for example, mental illness, like when do you recognize and understand that maybe as a result of some sort of brain disorder or condition that there are other aspects of their health mentally that needs to be touched on and aware of by the parent and caregiver, especially if they don't necessarily feel like they're experts in that. How might you approach that? Maybe Stephanie, if you want to give that a go.
Sure. So I think about this a lot. As a child youth psychiatrist, my area of focus is in the sort of intersection between autism and mental health. So I see young people usually as young as 6, but all the way up to 24, and they're coming to our clinic at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health because they have a prior autism diagnosis, and they or their family members are wondering if there's an additional mental health diagnosis that is there that needs some support, or they have a very complex mental health presentation and somebody's wondering if autism is part of the presentation. And I often think about brain development through that process because the timing, the onset, and kind of the trajectory of different mental health symptoms, they actually coincide with regions of the brain that are developing at different times. So, peak time for anxieties like between the ages of 9 and 12, and that tends to be also a time where the front of the brain that's really important in kind of thinking about ourselves in relation to others and in our relation to the world sort of starts to mature. And when we get to kind of the extreme end of that development where you're kind of being scared about all sorts of things about you within the world and all of the things that can happen. And so usually what we see is kind of this predictable timing of onset of different conditions, and they tend to coincide with what's happening in terms of brain development. So for individuals who have neurodevelopmental conditions like autism or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, they tend to be at higher likelihood of developing other mental health conditions. So I often talk about how development is dynamic, and you do have to take the long view and think about how much change can happen over time, and where you are now is not necessarily where things end up. It's usually not. And that you also have to think about some of the things that could happen over time. And sometimes individuals who have more complex presentations, they can accumulate other things over time because of experiences they have, experiences of adversity. So we're not quite sure why individuals who have neurodevelopmental conditions have a higher likelihood of developing other mental health diagnoses over time. It could be genetics, it could be biological, it could also be a combination of things in their experience. They might be more likely to experience social adversity and bullying and all of those things. So it is important as parents to kind of think about how things are changing, but also think of the balance of things. So, you know, anxiety, sadness, anger, those are normal human emotions, right? And we need to experience all of the notes on the piano, right? We don't just want to stay within a very narrow range. We want people to have those experiences. Where mental health conditions and sort of concerns about those conditions come in is when there's a big impact. You know, when individuals are really experiencing distress themselves, or there's a lot of impact in terms of how they're managing at school, at home, in their relationships, and you see a change. You know, something has drastically changed from before. Something is happening sort of over and above what was happening before.
I mean, that was perfect. We had an audience question that was asking kind of how do you identify the line? Like, when do you know, is this something to be concerned about or to start addressing? And you kind of touched on that, and that's awesome. And I want to kind of go back to this idea of trauma-informed care, but also I'm curious what your thoughts are, Carrie, and Wendy, you can add too, on do we think maybe this idea of trauma has actually led to like these Western ideas of like OCD or ADHD, some of those other things that maybe is actually rooted in kind of the trauma and losing one's understanding of themselves when thinking about Western science?
I know that as a therapist, when I'm working with people who sometimes have had I call it a misdiagnosis of perhaps ADD, what I find is when they work through their trauma, they don't have those behaviors anymore. So I always say it's important to look at when somebody comes for support or help, however that might look. We need to look at trauma first, since trauma is a universal issue. It has the same trajectories, really, about where people end up. And I really do feel that sometimes, not always, but sometimes people are misdiagnosed because we tend to diagnose rather than maybe to assess first about trauma. So one of the things that we do in this new model or an old new model, I should say, is we look at the trauma. That is what we look at first and foremost. In the process of looking at that, you may find that there is something there where they're going to need support and help. But I think that I see so much trauma in the world, everywhere, and that trauma's passed down, and what we're seeing is what is happening to us too. We get quite afraid of what's happening in our environment. And I think that we don't look at trauma enough. I really don't think that we are looking at trauma as maybe one of the reasons why we're seeing so much anger out there in the world. Maybe it was trauma. It wasn't a mental health issue. It wasn't, something else. So that's what I do as a trauma specialist. I look first at, tell me your story. And I looked to see where that trauma came from, perhaps. And all of the people I see are coming from trauma. Many of them have worked through it, though. Just because people have trauma does not mean they cannot work through their trauma. You can, and when you work through your trauma, you stop behaving the way that you're behaving too, because you don't have to anymore. So I think we have to look at trauma as a reason that you might see children reacting in the way that they are. Children will behave in certain ways because they learn it as well. And those things get passed down to them. I think when I see people that have issues that are passed down to them genetically, maybe that came from trauma at some point too, right? Now we're in a place where we really have to look at other things and how we're going to help that child, right, in that family. But I definitely think that there are a lot more people that have trauma out there that are not aware that they have those behaviors. You know, I'll tell you a little story about a lady that came to me and she was not Indigenous. And she brought her son to me and said, "Please help my son, he's so angry." And I said to her, "Who else in your family is angry?" And she said, "No one. We have this wonderful family. They had a really good, close family. She raised her children, she and her husband, in the way that we would want people to raise their children, with love and kindness." And in looking back in this child's behavior, we found out that the grandmother had been in a refugee camp. And I said, do you have any memory of her or how her behavior was? And she went, "Yeah, she was really angry at everybody. We were really scared of her." And I said, the way epigenetics work, this child could have, now that child has that anger that has been passed down to him. And I said, so it's not his anger. We have to now work on him understanding that anger came from a woman who needed anger to protect herself. And it was passed down to him. And he has nothing to be afraid of. And he did. He worked through that anger and was no longer angry anymore. So I think, anger is connected to mental health issues too. But I think trauma is far more predominant in our world than we actually think. And look at what's happening in the world, right? So I think it's important to look at trauma.
Yeah. There's a few things about trauma that I think we trip up when we try to design these types of models. So, because if we don't decouple it as a curable aspect, it can get entangled with some of the other determinants, the navigation, like you said, maybe they were bullied, or maybe there's other things that are underneath some of those comorbidities. But if it's seen in a decoupled way, including, and this is something we're learning a lot from other different trauma-informed and strength-based designers, is in that innovation space, you're thinking ahead about triggering or re-emergence of older issues, memories. So how are you preparing for that person if you know you're going to walk in and maybe even start discussing a cognitive-oriented issue? How will you be preempting some of those probably pretty predictable reactions if you know by science that might be happening? What design aspects could you make sure the conditions are right to ensure? We hear about re-traumatizing, but it's in that moment of perhaps just maybe we could prepare better. Maybe there's ways to create that relationality and know that it's done with consent and in a more interactive way before some of those more challenging interactions take place.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, it sounds like a theme here is that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but it needs to have intent. You need to be able to have these conversations, understand and prepare for interaction, knowing that a parent's trauma may impact development of your child, and understanding that all of this is really important as part of care and informing that kind of care. So in terms of just general progress in this space, so kind of coming back to understanding that everyone's diverse in these spaces in which we interact with all kinds of people, especially during development. How has there been progress in the space in terms of appropriate and equitable access to brain health information and care, and how we inform our own approaches to care, and just as a general kind of point as we come close to the end of our conversation today. So I wanted to go to Jen, what are your thoughts on that approach or that progress?
So I think that those of us who work in research are working very hard to hear perspectives, to engage with patients and families, to reflect on how we engage with families to bring them in. So a lot of consultation, a lot of listening, a lot of attempts and approaches to be inclusive, to reduce as many barriers as possible. Very much we try to do that in any of the new research that we're building, and we think about it as we're looking back at some of the research that's already been conducted. And in clinical care all the time, trying to, as much as possible, identify when there's barriers to access and to mitigate those as much as possible. There's a lot of work being done in the research front from a clinical perspective. I think the other place that really has opportunities for headway here is population-based research, where sometimes people call it citizen science, but you're really very much out in the community, and it doesn't require a family to be in the healthcare system. It doesn't require a family to be in a clinic. It doesn't require a family to have a diagnosis, and that really allows sort of an exploration as much as possible that sort of removes those barriers. And I'm involved in a large Ontario-based sample that does that, and we were really able to look at where some of these inequities occur. So children who report really high traits when it comes to mental health concerns, but based on perhaps what ancestry they have or what racial group they're from, they're less likely to have a diagnosis. So they wouldn't even be in our clinics to necessarily participate. So I think that these approaches complement each other. So I think that by going to the population and engaging at the sort of citizen and population level allows us to perhaps see past and to prevent some of those barriers, and taking a trait-based approach, which has really been a big part of OBI and all the studies that we do, is not necessarily relying on labels or diagnoses necessarily, but looking across the traits, both positive and negative. And when you go to a general population, you can do that, strengths and weaknesses, but you really do get these much more representative samples. So I think that our kind of more clinical-based research and our population-based research can inform one another. They have their own places, but it is a nice way to really try to kind of remove the barriers that sometimes can creep in despite our best efforts.
Yeah, and just kind of for our audience and those listening online, can you clearly define the difference between population versus the clinical aspect of research and science?
Sure. So as a clinician, I see families of sick kids, so they're in the clinic, but somebody needed to refer them to come see me, their family doctor or their pediatrician. We would like to think in the Canadian system that we're trying to remove those barriers as much as possible, but there's lots of steps to getting that done. Population-based research, so the study I was involved, it's called Spit for Science. We were at the Ontario Science Centre, so anybody who was at the Science Centre could come up and participate in our research. And one of the questions we get is, well, it's a Science Centre, you have to pay to get in there, but the Science Centre's embedded and engaged in a higher needs community, and they do a really great job of giving access, school groups, libraries. So we've looked at that to make sure that the people who are in the Science Centre also are not experiencing those barriers. And that's just one example, but it really does, we've got 40,000 kids from across Ontario. That's quite representative, and lots of different experiences, and that's what you want. You want to be measuring across a wide range of experiences, so that when we can look at this individual variation, it's not about one thing, it's not about one label or one cell, it's about a whole range of different experiences that people have, so we can start to understand individual pathways. So as I said, those population-based approaches, those citizen science approaches help us answer some big questions, and sometimes then we kind of go back into our clinic samples where we have maybe some long-term access, we've got neuroimaging, we might have more in-depth information, but they act together, I think, to allow us to get a more representative sample.
Oh, it's really interesting. And just to kind of wrap up today and get insights from each of you and hearing each other talk about your experiences in this space, what are some final last words you'd like to give the audience about kind of the developing brain and what you've learned along the way in engaging in this work and in this space? We'll start with Wendy here.
Well, I'm super excited about, quite a few things, and that's because I come from a place in the system in which I didn't expect to be at this point in my career, being at a place where we've built some of the really important data sets, networks, surveillance systems, understanding of some of these really key time periods of potential impact. And we're now looking at things like ecosystems. We're looking at leveraging some of this relationality in the science system to build on this. So a couple examples, such as first exposure, where we've put together right up at the front, not an after the fact consultation, but looking at the Indigenous impact right up front. So there's a grandmother's circle that's looking at design of the study and community engagement from the beginning, a Black Health Village that's looking at some of the impacts there. And when I look at what is possible, not post-diagnosis, but into trajectory changing, self-directed, stay at home, do it yourself, even online opportunities, that's telling me that we are starting to be able to interact in spaces that could potentially improve the pressure that we're seeing in primary care and in pre-diagnosis supports. And that's where I find, like, people can do this for themselves. So I want to save the time and the energy. I'm seeing tremendous potential that we don't have to have subspecialty sick kids, 15, 20, 30-year trained researchers only doing this, because upstream, the teachable time in pregnancy, early infant interventions, networks of peer support, and data-informed implementation science, I see that can accelerate and incubate some tremendous knowledge, we don't need another 500 years to bring decolonized Indigenous ways of knowing into science. There are some really good accelerators that are going to help us, and I see that as a tremendous benefit for all of us.
Oh, that gets me so excited. I love when you just really capture that so well, because it's like, once we can start addressing that on the nail right from the start, it's going to really change how we address or even tackle care and empowering those in their own personal care. Carrie, did you want to kind of add on some last words you'd like to leave our audience with?
I think what I have seen in all my years, I'm in my 70s now, so I've seen a lot of change, not tremendous change though. Where I've seen a lot of tremendous change is more from the neuroscience, and I think that it's important that we have all these different ways of knowing so that we can help those families and individuals, because we need all of those systems. But I also have discovered over time that people are very much coming from more of a relational perspective, and the more you talk about it, the more they step in and say, this doesn't work for me, this works for me. So I think what I am seeing is that human beings are coming from that relational place as well, and more of the work that we do has to be more holistic and relational, like what we're all doing here. We need all of us, but I really do see that more and more human beings that have never ever come forward about that are saying, this makes sense to me. And I think if we work together now, going forward, now that people aren't afraid to use the word holistic as we used to be at one time, I think what we will see is we'll start to see change, and we'll start to see healing in a different way, because we're including those pieces. We're not excluding each other from the dialogue of how do we help this individual or this family.
Yeah, really engaging with communities and doing it as a group, right? It's not going to take one person to do this, and we can learn from each other. Stephanie, what would you like to leave us with?
Well, I think it's been a great conversation, and it's made me reflect on what we know about the patterns of how we're similar and how our brains develop in a similar way over time, and that we can kind of leverage that knowledge, and also the power of big science and collaboration across different domains, as well as injecting it with the wisdom of the conversation that we had tonight, as well as the information that we get about what is a priority area in research from those individuals that we're hoping to serve. We inject all of that, and hopefully we learn who needs what, when, and how that helps us to actually organize clinical care that's efficient and can really support more people in lots of different ways. And that's really what I hope this work will end up showing.
And everyone kind of recognizing, like, if we can get this at its core, that's how we become more and more efficient with how we deliver care. And then finally,
What was said is beautiful. So
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
I feel like
There you go.
I will not add on.
Perfect. Well, with that, on behalf of the Ontario Brain Institute, I would like to thank each of our panelists for sharing your expertise today. We'd also like to thank the audience for engaging with us here in person and online on today's topic. Information will be presented on the screen shortly on any additional resources you can find on the braininstitute.ca, and you can go into the OBI public talks to find all the past talks that have happened, as well as other ways you can engage with OBI. Your feedback is also extremely valuable to us, so for those in person, there should be a sheet of paper that was on each of the chairs for you to fill out and give us some feedback on today's conversation, as well as how we can approach these talks in the future. And then the same thing applies to those online. You should be able to access that feedback survey using the QR code on the screen. And again, these talks are really designed to share the latest knowledge on brain health and to offer simple tips to manage both health and wellness. Our next talk coming up soon is Optimizing the Adult Brain in November of 2024, and we really hope to see you all there. Thank you again for being here today. Thank you to our panelists for tonight. Round of applause, everyone.